In the last video, I introduced you to Aquinas' famous 5 ways, his 5 favorite arguments for the existence of God. I'll also introduce you to 2 of the leading arguments against the existence of God, which Aquinas considers in his work. In this episode, what I want to talk about is I want to go into more depth with respect to one of his arguments for the existence of God, the second way, the argument from efficient causality. I want to show a little bit more about the nuts and bolts about how he's working through this argument. We won't be able to settle everything here, but I want to give you at least a deeper look at this second way. I also want to go through his replies to the arguments against the existence of God to see whether they're any good, see what he says about them. So here's what you'll need for this lecture. You'll need, once again, your reading from St. Thomas, because I am going to look at what he says about the arguments against the existence of God. You'll also need this handout, or I think it's under handouts, on the Canvas page, which gives an overview of his second way. And there's important quotation on the back as well that you should check out. So I read it last time. I won't read through the passage all again, but with that handout, let's take a look at how maybe best to formulate his second way, which is a cosmological argument, his argument from efficient causality. It seems that there are 3 main premises to this argument, the way that he describes it, and a conclusion. So the argument seems to go something like this. Premise 1, there is an ordered series of efficient causes among sensible things. Premise 2, it is impossible that a thing be the efficient cause of itself. And premise 3, it is not possible for an ordered series of efficient causes to continue indefinitely. Conclusion, therefore, there is a first efficient cause, and this we call God. So 3 main premises, but he also offers support or sub-arguments for premise 2 and premise 3. Once again, premise 2 says that it is impossible that a thing be the efficient cause of itself. Why can't something be the cause of its own existence? Here's what he says. Well, if something is an efficient cause of something else, then that first thing is prior to the second thing. But it is impossible that a thing be prior to itself. Thus, it is impossible that a thing be the efficient cause of itself. So what he's saying is like, look, in order to cause yourself to exist, you have to exist in some sense before you exist, which clearly is impossible. So nothing can cause itself to exist. And the third premise is that it is not possible for an ordered series of efficient causes to continue indefinitely. In other words, what he's going to suggest here is that there can't be an infinite series of things causing other things. Why not? That's one of the things I want to explore in this video. But maybe it'll be helpful if we take a step back and look at the whole argument, let's say, in plain English. He's using a lot of technical terms here. Let's try to break it down into plain English. I have this on the handout as well. Here's roughly how the argument goes in plain English. Premise 1 is that we see that some things are caused to exist. We see, just looking out in the world, we see that some things are caused to exist. Okay, doesn't matter how many things, it's just you start with some. Premise 2, but nothing can cause itself to exist for the reasons that he's given. And there are a couple implicit premises here, maybe. And so those things that we see that are caused to exist must be caused to exist by other things. So if nothing can cause itself to exist, then the things that we see that are caused to exist must be caused by other things. And since nothing can cause itself to exist, it seems that those other things must themselves be caused to exist by further things. And those further things caused to exist by still further things, and so on. So if nothing can be the cause of its own existence, and some things are caused to exist, then it must be caused by other things. And those things, too, can't cause themselves, so they must be caused by other things, and so on. Premise 3 is the crucial premise that says, but the causal chain of things causing other things to exist can't be infinite. And so the conclusion is that there must be something that causes all other things to exist, but which is not itself caused to exist. So once again, right, the first premise, just as an observation premise, it says that, well, look, some things, at least one thing, is caused to exist out there. We see it. But it can't have caused itself to exist, and so it must be caused by something else. But that something else can't cause itself either, and so it must have been caused by something else. Does this go on forever? Premise 3 says, no, it can't go on forever. We can't have an infinite series of things causing other things. And so there must be a first. There must be something that's causing all other things to exist, but which itself is not caused. That's the general structure of the argument. I think one of the really crucial questions here is we've seen which seems plausible, his reason for thinking that nothing can cause itself to exist. He doesn't need the claim that everything is caused to exist. Remember, the premise one is just that some things are caused to exist. If you give him one thing that's caused to exist, he thinks that the argument can work. So those two premises maybe are okay, but what about the third one? Why can't the causal chain go on forever? Why can't it be infinite? So if you turn the handout to the other side, Aquinas isn't perfectly clear about why he thinks it can't be infinite in this particular part of the text. But there's a later question of the Summa Theologiae in which he does give a more thorough explanation. So I've included the passage on this handout. I want to read through it and then unpack a little bit about what he's doing here. So why can't the causal chain of things causing other things to exist be infinite? Here's what he says. In efficient causes, it is impossible to proceed to infinity per se. Thus, there cannot be an infinite number of causes that are per se required for a certain effect. For instance, that a stone be moved by a stick, the stick by the hand, and so on to infinity. But it is not impossible to proceed to infinity accidentally as regards efficient causes. For instance, if all the causes thus infinitely multiplied should have the order of only one cause, their multiplication being accidental, as an artificer acts by means of many hammers accidentally, because one after the other may be broken. It is accidental, therefore, that one particular hammer acts after the action of another, and likewise it is accidental to this particular man as generator to be generated by another man, for he generates as a man, and not as the son of another man. For all men generating hold one grade in efficient causes, namely the grade of a particular generator. Hence it is not impossible for a man to be generated by man to infinity, but such a thing would be impossible if the generation of this man depended upon this man, and on an elementary body, and on the sun, and so on to infinity. So this is also a very sort of technical distinction here, but what he's drawing is a distinction between two senses of two ways in which something can be the cause of something else's existence. And so this introduces two kinds of causal series, or two kinds of causal chains. Now first, let's maybe talk about the difference in ways in which something can be the cause of something existence. Well, one of the ways in which something can cause something to exist is sort of it can cause it to bring it into existence. This is a temporal notion, is that before the thing didn't exist, and then something did something which brought the thing which didn't exist before into existence. So in this sense, right, what we have is something's causing, and then later on, something's coming to exist. So this is the ordinary way we think of something's being the cause of something else's existence. So we ask, like, what is the cause of your existence? You say, my parents, right? My parents, right? Yada, yada, yada. Here I am, right? They are the cause of my existence. But Aquinas is also pointing out that there's a different sense in which something can be the cause of its existence. It can be the cause of its existence not in the way in which it brought it about in the first place, but that it is in a way holding it in existence or suspending it in existence. So something can bring something into existence in time, but something can also be the explanation for why it exists right now, such that if you took that thing away, then the thing would immediately cease to exist. So we can think of this sort of as the bringing it into existence as a kind of temporal notion. The cause comes before the effect. The holding in existence is more like it's causing the existence of the thing right now. Simultaneously with the thing's existing, there is a cause of its existence. Well, what's an example of this? Well, we can talk about not just maybe existing, but existing in a particular way. We can ask about, like, right, what's holding my mug up right now? Well, I am, meaning that you hold up the mug and then it's, 3 feet above the ground? No. I'm holding it up at the same time that it is 3 feet above the ground. So its being 3 feet above the ground is caused by my holding it up at the very same time. The cause and effect are simultaneous. Aquinas seems to have this idea that it works for existence. There's something holding you in existence right now. Now, what sort of things would be holding you in existence right now? Here's sort of the example that he gives. He talks about elementary bodies and on the sun, and so on to infinity. So what is he talking about here? It's like, well, one of the ways we can go in two directions to explain what's holding you in existence right now. We can go to your parts. So what's the cause of your existence right now? Not what happened, not what caused you to exist in the first place. That's your parents. But what's causing you to exist right now? Well, what could you take away such that would mean your demise? Well, I need a heart and lungs. Okay, good. And what about your heart and lungs? What do they need to be in existence? Well, they need, tissues and muscles, right? And blood and oxygen. Okay. So you can talk about your parts, and then you can talk about your parts of your parts, and so on. Things holding each other in existence by being parts of, by being constitutive of. But we can also go in the other direction. What's holding you in existence right now? Well, various atmospheric conditions, right? A certain temperature in the room. If you were to crank the temperature up 200 degrees, or if it were to be 200 degrees colder, I would instantly perish. So what's causing me to exist? Some very favorable atmospheric conditions. I need the gravity to be set at a particular level. And we might ask, well, okay, what's causing those atmospheric conditions to be as they are? Not what caused them to exist in the first place, but what's causing them to be and maintain them right now? Well, it has to do with something to do with the position of the Earth and the structure of the atmosphere and the position of the Earth with respect to the sun. Okay. And what's explaining, right, the position of the Earth, and what's explaining the condition of the atmosphere right now? And so on and so on. So that's supposed to illustrate the difference between something's causing it to exist temporally or something's holding it in existence right now, in which something is at this very moment holding you in existence. Now, importantly, I think when Aquinas says that the causal chain can't be infinite, the kind of causation that he's talking about in this second way, I think importantly, has to be the second sense. It has to be the holding in existence sense. It can't be the bringing into existence sense. His argument, he thinks, right, won't work if you try to do it in terms of a temporal first cause of the universe. Importantly, he's not talking about a temporal cause. When he says that God is the first cause, what he means is the first cause in the sense that he's the thing holding everything else up, and everything else is being held up by God right now, simultaneously with its existing. It's not that God is somehow at the beginning of time causing it to exist. Aquinas does think that God is at the beginning of time causing it to exist, but he doesn't think that this is the argument that we should focus on. He thinks that we should focus on the second kind of causality, the holding in existence kind of causality. So to get a little bit more technical, these two ways of causing something to exist introduce two kinds of causal chains, or two kinds of causal series. What is known as an accidentally ordered causal series and an essentially ordered causal series. Now, an accidentally ordered causal series is the temporal one. It is when something brings it into existence over time. And so what you get in an accidentally ordered causal series is you get something causing something else, and then that thing causes something else, and that thing causes something else. But each of these steps happens at a different point in time. The example that he uses is begetting or generating, right? So how did you come into existence? Well, when your parents conceived you. And how did your parents come into existence? Well, your grandparents. That was an earlier time. And then what about your grandparents? Well, that was an earlier time when their parents conceived them. Notice that at each of these steps, we're at an earlier point in time. It's not that all this is happening at the same time. That would be weird. It's not that any of the steps are happening at the same time, right? It wouldn't work that way. So it's spread out in time. The moment at which your parents bring you into existence is not the same moment that their parents bring them into existence. And it's not the same moment that their parents brought them into existence. So that's an accidentally ordered causal series. It is spread out in time. And the important feature about an accidentally ordered causal series, Aquinas thinks, is that because it's spread out in time, it means that the earlier causes can drop out by the time that the later causes do their thing. So, for example, the begetting example. Your parents can give rise to your existence, even if, sadly, your grandparents have already passed on. Now, what makes that possible? What makes that possible is that the cause has been sort of passed on like a baton. Is that once your grandparents give one of your parents his or her existence, then they're no longer in a way needed for that, right? They can cease to exist, and your parent can still go on to cause your existence. So the baton is sort of passed on. In an accidentally ordered causal series, you can get rid of all the earlier ones, and the later one can still do its thing. That's an accidentally ordered. It's because it's spread out in time that this is possible. But an essentially ordered causal series, this is the simultaneous one. This is the sense of causing something to exist, not in time, but holding it in existence simultaneously with it existing. So what are some examples of this one? Well, we talked about the example of your parts holding your existence, or things larger than you holding your existence. But the first example that Aquinas uses here is what I'd like to call the shuffleboard example. He's talking about the hand, someone's hand moving a stick, which is moving a stone. I don't know why someone would do that, but I'm calling it like the shuffleboard example. You know, imagine you're pushing the stick, which is pushing the puck, that the stick being pushed by your hand. Now here's an example in which all the causation seems to be happening at the same time. So at the same time you are pushing the stick is pushing the puck, and the puck is moving, or the stone. And so this has got to be an essentially ordered causal series, because all of it is happening simultaneously. The causes and effects are happening all at once. And so an important feature of this kind of causal series is that because it's happening all at once, if you were to drop out some of the earlier causes, the ones that are higher up in the chain, then all the other ones would immediately cease as well. So if I were to cease pushing the stick with my hand, then the stick would cease pushing the stone, and the stone, or the puck, maybe not immediately, but it would cease moving, right? With the exception, right, of me sort of playing shuffleboard, it relies on me being able to push the puck down sort of its own accord. But if you're just pushing it without letting it go, the idea is that the puck is only moving because the stick is moving, the stick is only moving because the hand is moving. If the hand were to stop moving, they'd all stop moving. Well, perhaps an even better example, this is obviously not one that St. Thomas could come up with, but the idea of like train cars. So you watch the train going by, and you see car after car after car, and each car is pulling the one that comes afterwards. But notice that each of the cars can only pull the one after it if the one that's in front of it is also at the same time pulling. If the one in front of it were to stop pulling, then it too would cease pulling. It could no longer pull any of the cars that come after it. This has got to be then an essentially ordered causal series, not an accidentally ordered one. Now here's the thing about an essentially ordered causal series. Aquinas thinks that because when you take away the earlier causes, you lose all the later causes in essentially ordered causal series, which is not the case for an accidentally ordered. He thinks in an essentially ordered causal series, there has to be a first. Why? Because what's indicated is that when you take away the earlier causes, then the later causes cease what they're doing. What this shows us is that the later causes don't have any of their own causal oomph on their own. All of their causal oomph is borrowed from the earlier causes. And so what you need at the front of the line is something that does have its own causal oomph, which is passing on the causal oomph in all of the other members of that series. It's a bit like, think again of our train example. Each of the cars doesn't have its own pulling power. The only pulling power any of the cars have is what it gets from the engine. The engine is unique in having its own pulling power, and all the other cars have derivative or borrowed pulling power. And that's indicated by the fact that if you remove any of the cars from the car in front of it, then it stops pulling. It shows that it doesn't have its own pulling power. Except for the engine. You could remove all of the other cars, and the engine can still pull. Why? Because it has its own pulling power. It is a first efficient cause. It doesn't depend for its pulling power on anything else. And so what Aquinas is trying to argue here then is that an accidentally ordered causal series, because each member of the series has its own causal oomph, has its own pulling power, as it were, then that could in principle be infinite. And that's the temporal one. What Aquinas is saying is that there could be an infinite temporal series going back forever. Maybe the causes go all the way to our Big Bang. We made the Big Bang as a result of some other earlier bubble universe. And that universe has its own Big Bang, which is caused by... And maybe that goes on forever. Aquinas says, in principle, that could go on forever. This is important for understanding his argument. He's not talking about a temporal first. He doesn't think that it's impossible that you could have a temporal infinite series. What he's arguing is that not temporally, but simultaneously, there's also a causal chain of things holding other things in existence. And this, he thinks, cannot be infinite. Because no matter how many more you add to the chain, if it's infinite, you never get anything with its own pulling power or causal oomph. And if you don't have anything with its own pulling power or causal oomph, then you never explained the pulling power or the causal oomph of any of the other members. If you were to explain the pulling of each of the train cars just by setting more train cars, you'd never have a full explanation for why any of them are pulling. You need to bring in the engine in order to explain what's going on. Similarly, Aquinas thinks that you need to bring in some first efficient cause, something that's holding everything in existence right now, but which doesn't need to be held by anything else. And so I think that's a really important clarification for what's going on with the argument. Why does he think that it can't be the causal series of things causing other things can't be infinite? He says, well, if it's an accidentally ordered or a temporal series, it could in principle be infinite. But if what we mean is things causing other things sort of simultaneously in the essentially ordered series, holding other things into existence, that cannot go on forever. It must stop somewhere. There must be something holding everything else up, but which itself is not held up by anything else. Otherwise, we wouldn't have an explanation, a good explanation for how anything else is holding anything else up. That's roughly, I think, what's going on with the argument. So a possible objection to his argument is it's not clear why we can't have an infinite series. And his distinction between the kinds of causal series serves as his answer to that objection. He says, well, there's nothing in principle impossible about a temporal infinite series. But a hierarchical one, right, and one that goes simultaneously and is holding things holding each other up, that cannot be infinite. So that was a little bit complicated, a little bit technical. If you have questions about that, please feel free to send me an email. But that's a little bit deeper look. We could still go and puzzle about the particular claims that he makes there, but it gives you a deeper look for the second way, just to show you just how deep some of these arguments go. He gives them roughly in his description of the 5 ways in the part that we read, but he goes in more and more detail elsewhere. If you're interested, there's a lot more to learn about those. But let's go back to the 2 arguments against the existence of God that Aquinas considered. First, he considered the problem of evil. Roughly, the problem of evil or the problem of suffering is the idea that, look, there's lots of bad stuff in the world. If there were a truly good God and a truly powerful God, then he would do something about it. And the fact that it exists then is evidence that there is no such being. How does Aquinas respond to this one? Here's what he says. As Augustine says, this is in his reply to objection 1. Remember, the problem of evil came in his objection 1. So in order to see how he responds to the problem of evil, we have to look at his reply to objection 1. And here's what he says. As Augustine says, since God is the highest good, he would not allow any evil to exist in his works, unless his omnipotence and goodness were such as to bring good even out of evil. This is part of the infinite goodness of God, that he should allow evil to exist and out of it produce good. Well, what's he saying here? I don't think this is a full answer to the problem of evil. In order to give a full answer to the problem of evil, I think it would take at least a book, maybe several books. But what Aquinas, I think, is giving here is something like a formula for how you might go about trying to answer the problem of evil. And here's roughly the formula that he seems to be giving us here. In order to explain how evil could be compatible with God, here's what you need to do. You need to come up with some reason that God could have for allowing this evil. Now, the only reason that could really explain it, is if there was some good that God wanted. And he wanted it so much, it was so good, that it could outweigh its worth all of the evil, all of the suffering. And furthermore, that this good that he wants, not only is it so good that it outweighs all that bad stuff, but even God can only get that good thing if he allows the suffering and the evil. Now, that might be really tough. Well, wait a second. How could something be so good that it could possibly outweigh, right, even the most heinous instances of evil? Young girl dying of cancer, the Holocaust. How could anything be so good that it would be worth that? And furthermore, right, we also have to establish that even God could only get that good thing if he allows that evil. But if God's all powerful, right, how could he be limited in that way? How could he only get the good thing that he wants by letting in this bad stuff? Isn't that a limitation on his power? So this is going to be a hard task, but these are the conditions for success that Aquinas outlines for us. Maybe we can brainstorm a little bit about how this would work. What would be something that would be so good that it could outweigh all of the evil, and yet even God could only get that if he admits the evil? Well, I can think of maybe two possible answers. You might think that our ability to freely love God is this massively good thing. Not just our loving God, but our freely loving God. And indeed, you might think that if you aren't free, then it doesn't count as real love. Anyway, maybe it's redundant to say sort of freely loving God. But anyway, maybe our ability to freely love God is such a tremendous good that it might outweigh all the suffering. And you might think that in order to allow us to freely love God, we have to be able to choose wrongly. We have to be able to perform all these moral evils. And so, like, if God were to prevent all of the moral evils from taking place, then he would limit our free will in such a way that it might not even really count as legitimate free will anymore. Maybe just by definition, that in order for an action to be, or maybe in order for choice to be really free, it has to be open to you to be able to choose the bad option. So maybe that's one possible explanation, but at best that would maybe only explain some of the moral evil. What are some other possible answers? Well, within the Christian tradition, the answer I think that can be given for a tremendous good that's so good that outweighs the evil and only God can get it if he admits the evil would be something like this. Maybe something like the incarnation and the atonement, that God would become one of us and that he would die for our sins in order to redeem us. Maybe that is such a tremendous good, right? Maybe the idea is that Christianity is not only the best story ever told, but the best story that ever could be told. Maybe the incarnation atonement is so overwhelmingly good and special that it could outweigh all of the bad stuff. But also, here's the other thing about the incarnation and the atonement. If the world is not fallen, if the fall does not take place, then neither does the incarnation and atonement. There's no need for it. So in order to get the good, the great good that is the incarnation and atonement, you have to have that fallen world. And once you have a fallen world, then maybe you get all of the evils. So, I don't know. There's a lot that can be said about both of these. These are two common strategies for dealing with the problem of evil. I don't know whether either one of them is successful, but you could see how someone might try to argue that they meet the conditions for a successful response to the problem of evil. Aquinas hasn't given us these. All he's given us are the conditions, and he goes on elsewhere to explain some more of the details about how we might reply to that. So that's his strategy for answering the problem of evil. That doesn't settle it. It's a long discussion further. If you're interested, there's a lot to read and that I can recommend. We discuss this issue in several other courses that we offer. Well, let's talk about the second argument for the existence of God, the argument from science. The argument here was that God is an unnecessary hypothesis. There's nothing in the natural world we need to bring in God to explain. Here's what Aquinas says in his reply to this in reply to objection 2. He says, since nature works for a determinate end under the direction of a higher agent, whatever is done by nature must needs be traced back to God as to its first cause. So also whatever is done voluntarily must also be traced back to some higher cause other than human reason or will, since these can change or fail. For all things that are changeable and capable of defect must be traced back to an immovable and self-necessary first principle, as was shown in the body of the article. So what is Aquinas' reply to the argument from science? His reply is essentially, dude, go back and read my 5 ways. Because what he's suggesting in each of the 5 ways is each one points to some observable feature of the universe that can't in principle be explained by the natural world itself. We have to go beyond the natural world to ultimately explain that observable feature. And so his reply to the argument from science is built into his arguments for the existence of God. Each one is trying to argue against this, that God is an unnecessary hypothesis. They're all trying to point to some feature that we do have to bring in God in order to really explain it. So those then are Aquinas' 5 ways in his replies to the 2 main arguments against the existence of God. Are many of his arguments for the existence of God good ones? I don't know, but I tried to explain roughly how they go and just how deep you can go in your analysis of them. Do any of the arguments against the existence of God work? Do any of Aquinas' replies get around them? I'm not sure. There's a lot more discussion to be had about this, right? The history of philosophy is full of attempts to formulate the argument from evil or respond to it. There's no shortage of stuff that you can read to consider this further. What I wanted to show you is just how much work reason and argumentation can do, just how much progress, just how much philosophy can do, even in the realm of things that appear to be just religious matters, things pertaining to faith. And so philosophy is not just something you do sort of on the side to try to figure out how best to write your essay or how best to study for this exam. It's not even about sort of technical critical thinking. It also helps you to really think carefully and critically about the things that matter in your life. As we looked throughout this course, right, think of the big questions that we considered. In Plato's Crito, we asked about what sort of responsibilities do we have to the state, to the government that nurtured and raised us. In the Republic, we considered what reasons we have for being morally good, even in those cases in which we can get away with being morally bad. In Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, we considered such big questions as what is the purpose or goal of human life? What is true happiness and how can I get it? In the stuff from medieval philosophy, we considered really big questions such as what is the nature of free will and do we have it? And does God exist? Can reason show one way or the other? And so as sort of the concluding remarks here in our last video for the course, I just wanted to say that I think that philosophy is really important, and not just for some people who find it interesting. I think that philosophy is absolutely crucial to study. If you can't think carefully and critically about these big important questions, if you're not doing philosophy, as I say, then you're living underneath someone else's philosophy. You're operating by means of someone else's. So philosophy helps you to be able to think for yourself. It helps you be able to think carefully and critically so that you can think about what you think about these issues and to be able to persuasively argue your point and to be able to reliably investigate it to figure out what the right answer is or what the best argument for a view is. And so I hope you're able to see sort of the value of studying this. My hope is that you'll be able to study it further, or that you'll at least appreciate that this is the sort of thing that everyone should have to take. This is the sort of thing that everyone should be doing in their lives. That it's crucially important that we study philosophy, that we search for truth about life's big questions by means of reason and argument. So I missed all of you in this second half of the course. As you're working in your assignments, please keep in touch. Please keep me in the loop. Let me know how you're doing. I will get some of the stuff ready as we're going forward for the final exam. But I really enjoyed the class. I really enjoyed getting to know each of you while we were in person. I look forward to talking with you about your remaining assignments. But I had a blast. Thanks a lot, guys. Wishing you all the best.